In any case of conflict resolution involving a third party, it is normal and expected that one of the goals that the third party will try to bring about is that, of course, the conflict is resolved, but also that those countries will embark on a democratic course. That is to say, they will democratize. If before they were an authoritarian government or a totalitarian government, after, when the peace is restored, they will establish a democratic form of government. Now, this is more than just the fact that the Western countries that generally lead these efforts happen to be democracies. It's more than just a sense of being a copycat. First off, if people truly have a vote and they truly have a say in their government's actions, will they vote for the government to abuse their human rights? No, they won't. So usually a true democracy where people have meaningful votes and their representatives reflect the will of the people don't abuse human rights. I mean, all systems are fallible, of course, but I mean in general, they do not abuse human rights. Another example is that if people are in control of their government, if there is a democracy, these governments tend to be more transparent. That is to say, that means many things, but in my sense, there's less corruption. If there is corruption, you can find it, you can eliminate the corruption, and you make for a more efficient and equitable governance structure. A third one that is very, very big and important is what's called democratic peace theory. And that is, simply stated, the well-studied and confirmed so far, theory that democracies do not go to war with other democracies. So arguably one way to reduce conflicts so that conflict resolution becomes less necessary is to make more countries democracies. And I stress that this has been highly studied and these results are highly valid so far. Now, another reason is that democracies tend to allow for productive economies. It means, again, the people vote on their own interests, and oftentimes their interests are to better themselves, and one of the ways they better themselves are through education and the allowance to start their own businesses and lead productive lives. So democracies are kind in general to healthy economies. And of course, the higher that a person's wealth is, the higher the per capita income in a country, that correlates very heavily to stability again. So that's another side of how you avoid conflict in the first place. And then this one's less strong, okay, but it's the idea that democracies where people have a true say in their government tend to allow multiple nationalities to live together without violence, okay? And ethnic conflict or violence between different cultural and ethnic groups within a country is one of the leading causes of conflict. So I'm not saying that's perfect, and it usually depends on whether nonviolence has become a norm, which takes time. If the definition of democratization that we've been working with so far is the process through which a formerly authoritarian state becomes a democracy, then a very, very important question is, what is a democracy? And I think we all have a general idea, and most of us would style it upon our own U.S. democracy. This can get those engaged in conflict resolution in some trouble if they're not careful, because in fact, there is really a continuum of democratic governance. When somebody says, my country is a democracy, this actually can mean several things, all right? So for the sake of illustration, let's consider two different cases. One I will call substantive democracy. Substantive democracy means that voters' votes actually count, and that government reflects the practice of the public will expressed through voting. So let me set that one aside for a minute and talk about another kind of democracy. That is procedural democracy. Now, in a procedural democracy, you will have elections. You will have a legislature of elected individuals. You'll have courts You'll have a police force. And generally, when you have all of these things, there'll be some degree of universal participation. So what we tend to call universal suffrage. Most people will have the vote. Now, what can go wrong there? Well, perhaps the vote is rigged. The elections are rigged. Perhaps the legislature, call it a parliament, call it a Congress, perhaps it's not really independent, but votes the way that the leader, the senior executive, the leader of the executive branch tells them to vote. Perhaps all the judges are afraid to rule fairly, and they rule, they interpret the law the way that the leader tells them to do it. Well, then this would be, I think most of us would agree, this would be a democracy in form only, and that the results of all these institutions, the votes, the parliament, etc., reflect what the leader wants. So in other words, it's a thinly disguised authoritarian government. All right, so in contrast, what I just mentioned before, substantive democracy has all those things. It has elections, it has the parliament, it has the executive, it has the courts, it has universal suffrage, but these are legitimate institutions that are enduring and that do allow fair voting, and that fair voting, the will of the people, is translated into government action. So as I think you can see, it's really a big difference when you're talking about democratization to say, is this country headed towards a pure procedural democracy where really it's the strong man who calls all the shots, or is this country actually headed towards a substantive democracy? It's really an important question. Now, thinking of examples, where does Iraq stand right now? Where does Afghanistan stand right now? Just for two examples. They have a parliament, they have leaders, so on and so forth. Now, one of the big things I would offer is the term culture of democracy. So when you're trying to assess, where are we here? And by the way, it's a continuum, right? You can be a procedural democracy moving towards substantive. You can be an imperfect substantive. It's not as simple as the illustration, right? But the illustration is useful. But when you're trying to assess where a given country stands, how are they doing on developing a culture of democracy? And what that means to me is, have they mastered the art of peaceful conflict resolution? One of the major indicators is whether the president or the premier or whatever that person is called who's in charge of the executive branch, whether that person runs a fair election and steps down if voted out. I think you can think of a lot of examples where the same president stays in power many, 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 many years. Each time apparently there's a vote, each time the vote is contested. That's more like a procedural democracy. So, very important question to keep in mind as you think about particularly the nation-building aspect after a conflict has been resolved. Are you working towards primarily a procedural democracy, which would look like a democracy but not really be one? Or are you working towards a true substantive democracy in which the will of the people is truly reflected in the government's actions?